Connecticut, and thank you to everyone in the audience for tuning in. Welcome to the second year of Nature's Returns, Investing in Ecosystem Services. This webinar series is sponsored by the Yale Center for Business and the Environment and the Conservation Finance Network at Island Press. My name is Tommy Herbert, and I am a current Master of Forestry candidate at Yale. I will be your host for today's presentation. Today's presentation, Community Forests and Regional Economic Development, is the second presentation in a mini-series focusing on the intersection between ecosystem services and community development. Our featured speaker is Joe Short, Director of Public Policy, Biomass Energy, and Ecosystem Services at the Northern Forest Center. At the Northern Forest Center, Joe leads the Northern Forest Investment Zone Management Team. He will specifically discuss the Northern Forest Center's strategies to building economic resilience, reinforcing healthy communities, and supporting sustainable forest ecosystems across New England. Joe first came to the center in 2003 as a Doris Duke Conservation Fellow and joined the full-time staff in 2004. He helped coordinate the initial work of the center's policy program, convening regional dialogue and developing consensus strategies for public policies focusing on community, economic, and conservation needs in the Northern Forest. This work led to the center's Sustainable Economy Initiative, which Joe managed from 2005 to 2008, helping a four-state steering committee create a sustainable economic development strategy for the Northern Forest based on economic revitalization tied to continuing land conservation. Joe has a Master of Science in Resource Ecology and Management from the University of Michigan and a Bachelor's in Biology from Carleton College. Earlier in his career, he worked for 4 years for the Nature Conservancy, first in Nebraska and then in Northern California. A few quick reminders. This 60-minute webinar will be recorded and made available through iTunes U, and a copy of the presentation will be made available on the CBAY website under the Outreach tab. The presentation will be approximately 40 minutes and will be followed by a question and answer session. Please see the question box below and type in your questions during the presentation. We will relay these questions to Joe at the conclusion of his talk. I would like at this point to hand it over to you, Joe.
Great, thanks Tommy, and hello everybody. I was telling Tommy this is a strange way to give a talk. I'm sitting in a room by myself in Concord, New Hampshire, but trusting that you're all out there. And thank you, Tommy, and the other organizers for this invitation. And I think it's great that the Yale Center for Business and the Environment and the Conservation Finance Network are putting this on, and particularly have identified this focus on how ecosystem services and community development relate to one another. I think it's an important way to look at the larger conversation of ecosystem services, and also particularly timely. My focus, as you can see on the screen, is a bit different, broader, I think, than the title is advertised. It's morphed a bit over the last 10 days as I've worked on it. I will be talking about community forests, but also want to talk about the center's broader work to connect ecosystem services and community benefit in the Northern Forest. All right, I'm waiting for my slide to advance. There we go. So a quick sense of where we're headed. I want to talk a bit about the Northern Forest region and my organization, the Northern Forest Center, and then spend some time talking about how ecosystem services, markets, and community development align. I think there's some interesting facets to that conversations, and this conversation was a good spur to do some of my own thinking on that. So I'd like to throw some ideas out there and then hope that that question is one that we might pick up in the Q&A as well. And then I want to discuss some examples from the Northern Forest of how my organization is working on ecosystem services and community development in tandem, speak to some of the challenges and opportunities we've observed, and then leave, I hope, a healthy amount of time for your questions. So, the Northern Forest region is 26 million acres of forest across much of Maine, northern New Hampshire, northern Vermont, and the Adirondack and Tug Hill regions in upstate New York. This is a diverse forest: spruce fir, pine, and a lot of northern hardwoods. It is the headwaters of 8 major rivers: the Hudson, Mohawk, Connecticut, Merrimack, Androscoggin, Kennebec, Penobscot, and the St. John all find their headwaters in the northern forest region. I think a key distinguishing characteristic of the northern forest landscape is the predominance of private land ownership. About 80% of the forest land in the northern forest is owned by private landowners, and I think that's a almost direct mirror image of what we see in the West, where about 80% of the land is publicly owned. So when we talk about ecosystem services and conserving them, stewarding them in the northern forest, we're doing so in that private lands context, and I think that points us to some different strategies and tools from what we might see being tried in other parts of the country. Another defining characteristic of this landscape and the people that live on it is an economic dependence on the forest. This is historic, going back well over a century to a time when this region really was the birthplace of modern pulp and paper making, and a time when much of that 26 million acres was owned by industrial forest landowners who also owned the mills that wood went to. That dynamic has changed in the last several decades, as we'll see, but what has not changed is that economic connection to the forest that many of the communities in this region have. So my organization, the Northern Forest Center, is a nonprofit. We're based in Concord, New Hampshire, and we're founded in 1997. We're a team of 13 people. And we work as an advocate for the Northern Forest region, and our work is focused on how communities in the Northern Forest benefit from forest-based economic and conservation initiatives. So I think quite relevant to the focus of our conversation today. We put our work into three categories. We do a number of on-the-ground programs, demonstration projects across the region in 5 areas: wood products, renewable biomass, tourism, ecosystem services, and community forests. At the highest level, this really gets to our role as an advocate. We work in public policy at the federal and state levels on issues relating to forest conservation and rural development. We convene like-minded partners across the 4 states to share good ideas and best practices. And we work regionally to identify new investment and financing opportunities for those 5 sectors that we work in. So I wanted to spend a few minutes on the question of why is it important that ecosystem services investments support community development. I think it would be very easy to have 2 separate conversations here, talk about ecosystem services investment strategies and community development strategies. And I think in most conversations they don't necessarily cross. So that's why I think it's particularly valuable that this theme was identified for this mini-series. And here are some of my thoughts on why. First, a lot of what happens in a forest, or really any landscape, is decided by people. And those decisions have impacts, good, bad, or neutral, on ecosystem services delivery. We know that ecosystem services, by definition, benefit people, but if those benefits aren't tangible, and that often means in economic terms, then investments in ecosystem services can fail to gain public support. And that public support matters because of this, of politics. So many of the tools, I realize, that we use to conserve and steward ecosystem services in this country rely on support from state and federal policymakers. Think of forest legacy, NRCS programs, the new markets tax credits, conservation easement tax benefits, clean water regulation. Funding, enforcement, and use of these programs all relies on continued political support. And if conservation of ecosystem services doesn't gain support from the voting public, we risk losing those tools. I think a compelling, if unfortunate, example of this is in Coos County here in New Hampshire, where the county commissioners have taken up the charge of putting a conservation moratorium in place countywide. So no more public land acquisition or conservation. And that is because they believe that the already substantive conservation that's been done in Coos County has really hurt the county economy, has reduced jobs in the woods, and has had negative local economic impacts. Whether that is true or not, I think, is up for debate, but hopefully you see the point that if public benefits are not perceived from conservation and ecosystem services projects, they risk running into that dynamic and failing. Conversely, a more positive example of when public support is well aligned and results in some really good results. We often tell the story of the community of Grand Lake Stream, which is a community of about 100 people in Down East Maine, that several years ago elected to put all of their community savings, their rainy day fund, into the acquisition of what will become a 22,000 acre community forest project next to their community. And that is because of the real benefit that they see from that deal. The recreation benefits, the harvest benefits, and I think just the cultural and community pride benefits that are hard to put a value on, but which are very, very real in many parts of the northern forest. And when there is that community support for conservation, there are profit opportunities for investors, including the sale of conservation easements, the ability to harvest lands without opposition, the ability for folks who are buying, say, carbon offsets to derive the PR, the marketing benefits, not just of their carbon offsetting, but of local jobs, landscape stewardship, recreation, things of that sort. And investors are increasingly driving forest management decisions in the northern forest and in many private forested regions of the country. This, I think, is a compelling set of maps. I realize that unless you get very close to your screen, the key probably isn't readable, but the key colors to focus on are those in the blue family. Those are investment owners of different types. You see in 1994, red, which are the industrial forest landowners, really dominates the map. And 11 years later, you see the really striking shift to investment owners. And this map could be replicated across the entire northern forest, and again, I think across many forested landscapes in the US. So investment decisions are increasingly driving what happens on the forest landscape. And so that's why it's important to have this conversation about how those investments, which, as I'll discuss, often tie back to ecosystem services, do or don't deliver community benefit. So how can ecosystem services markets deliver community benefit? This is a slide that I often use to describe or define ecosystem services for folks who are not familiar with that term, which is a wonky one. This is a set of definitions from a UN report a number of years ago that I'm guessing are familiar to a number of you. But when we talk about ecosystem services, they include provisioning services like food, fiber, water, and fuel, regulating services like flood and fire control, and this is where carbon storage shows up as well. Cultural services, which I think are often forgotten, but aesthetics, recreation, and then supporting services like oxygen production, nutrient cycling, and soil formation. To think about which of these can be most explicitly tied to community benefit, I think, is an interesting exercise. And for me, and at least what the Northern Forest Center focuses on, are really two categories: those provisioning services and the cultural services. These are where we see really compelling opportunities to tie the conservation of ecosystem services to community benefits. And I think it's important not to forget about these. There's a lot of focus and good energy these days on carbon markets, watershed services, things of that sort. But those, I think, at this point remain harder to tie to real tangible community development objectives. So I think it's key, if we are going to link community development and ecosystem services, to not forget about, and indeed to put some focus into these two areas, the provisioning services and the cultural services. So now to some of those examples of how my organization is working to connect ecosystem services and community development in the Northern Forest. How do ecosystem services, wood, fire, and air, I couldn't quite make it earth, wind, and fire, translate to community benefit as well as returns to investors? And how can communities themselves become investors in land and in the services that land provides? I'm going to start with wood products manufacturing, and I think it's really important to note that, with the exception perhaps of real estate development, no other markets come close to developing the return on investment that management for timber does if you're a forest landowner. Timberland investors, or timberland investors in this region who manage for the long term, the rule of thumb is that they can expect a 4 to 6% return on investment. Shorter term investors, many of those investors in the blue on those earlier maps, may see an ROI in the 12 to 16% range, but those returns are not likely to be sustainable over time and will likely have negative impacts on the provision of ecosystem services from that land going forward. Production of saw logs and wood pulp is an ecosystem services investment that is very easy to tie to community development and community benefit. There are jobs in harvesting, in trucking, in the mills that process the wood. It's a key part of the tax base for many rural communities. But those returns depend on markets for those materials, and those markets are in flux. The recession really hammered sawmills with construction down, and even well before the recession, we've seen an exodus of pulp and paper manufacturing from this region, furniture manufacturing generally from the United States, and competition from other forest growing regions. And if those markets really shift or decline, again, that ties back to the ability of landowners to generate returns on their investment and and at the end of the day, keep their forest as a forest. So at the center, one of our strategies is to work to maintain markets for high quality wood and the community benefits and jobs that come from those markets by working with secondary wood products manufacturers to help them innovate and remain competitive in a global marketplace. These are things like implementing lean manufacturing and mass customization, basically techniques that allow them to more efficiently produce their products and tailor them to markets that perhaps their overseas competitors cannot reach. And it also gets at how companies market themselves differently. If done right, these innovations can generate returns for the landowners who supply the raw material, returns for the manufacturing facility owner, as well as those jobs and other economic benefits for local communities. Next to wood heat. Firewood is perhaps one of the most ancient and tangible ecosystem services. Markets for firewood and other forms of low-grade wood, affectionately known as biomass, are key to sustainable forest management. Not every tree, of course, makes a pulp log or a saw log. We have a tremendous opportunity in the Northeast to capture very real and significant community benefit from this resource by really returning to our roots in some ways and displacing fossil fuel heat, which we've gotten very accustomed to over the last couple of centuries, with modern wood heat. A couple of stats in addition to the ones on this slide. The Northeast uses 84% of the U.S. Supply of home heating oil, and 80 cents on every dollar spent on that oil leaves the local community in the region. There are now available high-efficiency, bulk-delivered, and fully automated wood pellet boilers. These are not stoves. They're boilers that sit in the basement that can be seamless replacement for oil-fired boilers. And these systems are very widely used and proven in Europe, but not widely known or used here in the US. The average homeowner who makes a switch from fuel oil to one of these systems saves at least $1,400 annually. So we have developed a program in the interest of really accelerating this market in the Northeast called the Model Neighborhood Project, which is focused on creating clustered demonstrations of this technology and its impact in what will be eventually 4 northern forest communities across the region. The goal of this project is to overcome 2 major barriers to wider adoption of this technology. One is just the perception barrier. This is unfamiliar, and that's a big hurdle for folks as they think about moving from the familiarity of an oil system to something new. So by demonstrating that these systems work, having neighbors speak to neighbors about their positive experiences, we can overcome that. A second barrier is one of financing. These systems do cost more than their fossil fuel-fired competitors, but those prices can come down with a greater market size, and there is a payback period on these systems that you can get a sense from the chart here that pellet prices have risen roughly with the rate of inflation in recent history, whereas oil prices and propane prices have risen at a rate several times above inflation. So with the savings that homeowners realize from putting one of these systems in, they can quickly recapture the extra cost that they had to put in up front, and then after that, keep significant savings in their pocket. There's a real community benefit and community development story to this type of conversion. This is a dashboard. This is online on our website. It's tracking in close to real time the benefits. This is from our project in Berlin, New Hampshire, and this is based on not quite 40 boilers, and most of those not yet running for a full heating season. But you can see just in a short amount of time, very significant savings for homeowners, significant net reductions in greenhouse gases, and where this really starts to be a compelling story is if we apply some pretty modest multiplier effects to the money that stays in the local economy as a result of this conversion, you see that really starting to add up. And over the expected 25-year life of the boilers, this project, which again is just 40 boilers in a single community, is expected to deliver $6 million in local economic impact. So you can scale that up over, imagine thousands of boilers instead of just 40, and begin to get a sense about how this new, in some ways returning use of the forest resource can tie very specifically to community benefit. So now to carbon markets, which again I think are what a lot of us think about these days when we hear the term ecosystem services. As this audience probably knows, the California cap and trade marketplace has started to create demand for forest carbon offset projects. And this is creating interest and opportunity for larger forest landowners in our region, as well as for carbon project development firms. I think a real challenge here is how to explicitly link the benefits of these projects to community development. It's very easy, and I would argue perhaps the default, for a landowner to take the money from an offset sale, put that to their own uses in ways that have little community impact, little local community benefit. But here's a great example of what is possible. Finite Carbon and the Down East Lakes Land Trust, this is up in Down East Maine, just sold 242,000 offsets from the Farm Cove Community Forest Project. This was just a couple of weeks ago. The Land Trust is going to use its just over $1 million profit from that deal to invest in the purchase of an adjoining 22,000-acre community forest, which, like Farm Cove, will be managed for ongoing community benefit, harvesting, revenues, recreation, and the like. So I think here is a great example of how these developing markets, these forest carbon offset markets, can really be accessed and captured for community benefit in a way that benefits the landowner, benefits the long-term delivery of ecosystem services, benefits the project developer, and benefits the local community. So to my last example of how communities themselves are becoming investors in the forest land that surrounds them and managing it for ecosystem services as well as for their community development objectives. Town forests are a very common model across New England, but a newer model of community forests, which we've developed as part of a group called the Community Forest Consortium or Collaborative, is focused on what's familiarly known as that triple bottom line, the local economic benefit, the community benefit, and ecological benefit. An example I want to share is the 13 Mile Woods Community Forest in Errol, New Hampshire, which is just over 7,100 acres. The community took ownership of most of that land, over 5,000 acres of it, in 2005, making use of something called the New Markets Tax Credit Program, which we assisted them with. It essentially provided a subsidized loan so that they could acquire the property. And it is really already, just in 7 years, this project has delivered some very significant community benefit. The community now controls the visual asset that is the 13-mile gateway, the drive, basically into the village center of Errol, which is really core to their identity. And they're maintaining a healthy and well-stocked forest that's generated more than $1.7 million in net revenues since the acquisition. It's enabled them to expand the size of their community forest. It's estimated that the harvesting that they've done there has generated over $2 million in earnings in the local logging sector that supports the equivalent of 2 full-time jobs and indirectly another 10 jobs. And over time, the continued sustainable timber management plan will continue to generate significant timber products at a sustainable rate and generate an estimated stumpage revenue of annual, I think, of almost, well, over $900,000, which will support initially the loan payments that the town is making on the loan they use to buy the property. But after that loan is paid off, that's money that can go into the local coffers for schools, roads, community facilities, whatever they deem is important to their community development objectives. So those are the examples that I wanted to share, and this map is one of the center's work across a large swath of our region, with each dot here representing a demonstration project where an ecosystem service, be it wood, fuel, carbon, water, recreation, or something else, is being managed to deliver tangible benefit to local communities and landowners. And it's our belief, if we can take these examples to scale, really so that these dots overwhelm this map, that if the economic and social wealth of this region is tied to sustainable forest management and the ecosystem services that it delivers, then the people in this region will be the best advocates and stewards for keeping the northern forest and the ecosystem services it provides intact for the long term. I'm going to begin to wrap up here, as I mentioned, with just a couple quick observations on some of the challenges and opportunities in this sphere of aligning ecosystem services and community development. First, I think, is the challenge of aligning investor and community objectives. As we saw in the community forest example in Maine and in New Hampshire, there are cases where those investment objectives and the community development desires of a local community align very well. But there are also potential scenarios where they don't, either where the landowner, for example, is just going to take the profit from a carbon offset sale and invest it to their own benefit, or they may be, and again, back to that map of the investment owners, managing land for short-term returns that will benefit their investors, but eventually that land will be, they'll be done with it, they'll pass it to someone else, and the local communities are left, which in some with what in many cases may be a degraded landscape, or a landscape that is no longer capable of providing the level of community benefit of economic return that it once was. So I think this alignment, engaging communities, looking for those opportunities where community objectives and forest management and investor objectives align, is a really key area of focus. Second, and related, is the question of, again, where do the benefits accrue from a forest land investment project? Do they accrue solely to the investors and to the landowners, or are there ways that they accrue to the local communities? And I think we've often, conservation deals often include, general discussion about how conservation can benefit the local communities. A key step, I think, that has to happen is moving beyond the general to the specific and building in, as was the case in a couple of those community forest deals, for example, very specific community uses. Not just assuming that those benefits will flow, but actually proactively cultivating them. And then lastly, I think a lot of this involves redefining how we societally derive wealth from nature. I think a good example is this whole notion of carbon markets, which is just foreign and frightening, or seems a little shady to a lot of landowners that I talk to. They, of course, intrinsically appreciate that forests deliver clean air, clean water, but the idea that they might sell it, and what strings does that come with, is something that's foreign and something that we're working to help landowners understand. So that's an example. It's a forest product that's always been there, but we haven't really understood how to quantify it or use it. So it's a different way of thinking about how wealth comes from a forest. And I think similarly, moving, particularly in this region, past the former model of extraction for export, which will continue to be part of the northern forest economy, but thinking about things like the local heating economy. How do we grow that? How do we use the local resource for local benefit? I think is another key part of redefining how communities interact with the forest around them. So I'm going to wrap up with that, and I look forward to your questions, and want to leave you with this this nice picture, but also a restatement of really one of the core beliefs of the center, and why we think it's so important to be thinking about community benefit and community development when we talk about conservation and ecosystem services. And that is that the forest supports a strong locally based economy. The economy supports thriving communities and the people who live in them, and those people in turn safeguard the forest. So that's the virtuous cycle we're hoping to achieve. So with that, Tommy, I'll pass it back to you and look forward to questions.
Thank you so much, Joe, for that really interesting talk and for the comprehensive picture of how the Northern Forest Center connects ecosystem services to community development. We really appreciated it. So we have lots of questions from the audience, and the first is related to the community forest initiatives. Can you talk a little bit about the financial aspects of these projects? It's such an interesting initiative given the context of private ownership in the Northeast. You mentioned 1.7 million in revenues. How do these get distributed among the community?
That's a great question. So at this point, and specific to that project, those revenue, the Arrow Community Forest is in a single community. There are examples of community forests that span multiple communities, and that, I think, is where this gets really interesting as you think about distributing the revenues over time. But specific to the Arrow Forest, it's all in one community. Right now, the revenues that they're realizing are going fully into paying back the loan that they took to buy the property. When we were recently up at this forest with our board and some of the local government folks, we're joking, but there was definitely some seriousness underlying it. I think they realize that once they're done paying the loan, it is going to get it's going to get trickier and potentially sticky, local, to think about how those revenues are are allocated. I think a key way that we believe we have to get at this again is through sort of proactive thinking about those situations. In Errol, there was a local community forest committee that was formed, and we've realized that those two types of groups really need ongoing support, so that they can do the planning and anticipating of community needs, as well as community possibilities in advance, to avoid some of those potentially nastier discussions. I think a reality, though, I mean, this is New England, small government town meeting. It's going to be challenging, and again, I think that points to engaging the community, both the decision makers, but the community writ large, early, so that they fully understand the benefits of a community forest and understand that it's not just about the dollars you can pull out of it, that there are other benefits they need to be thinking about as well.
Great, thank you very much for that explanation. Building on that, can you also describe a little bit some of the silvicultural aspects of community forest management? Who's responsible for treatments and management plans? How does the land-based component work?
Good question. So in all the projects that we've been involved in, a forest management plan has been part of the part of doing the deal. So that there were, and often conservation easements are a part of these deals as well. So those bring in another overlay that gets at management and can actually stipulate what types of management are allowable. In the Errol example, I believe, for example, the easement there allows, they have the luxury there of starting with a really well-stocked forest. So they're allowed to cut a certain percentage of growth each year, but not dip below that. So that's a management question that really is kind of predetermined by the easement and was part of creating the community forest. Often, and I think this is one of the nice aspects of community forests, the management is done by local foresters. And that, I think, adds another component of community control, where often the foresters are residents of that community or nearby communities, and again, have an eye on benefits and returns that go beyond just the dollar value.
Great, thank you. Another question from the audience is related to emerging biomass markets. Some critics warned that the demand created by these markets will threaten conservation goals by promoting more intensive or monoculture-focused management. How has the Northern Forest Center been successful in integrating biomass into a healthy community and conservation vision?
This is a really interesting question. I think so I'm sure a lot of the folks in this audience are familiar with surging pellet demand from Europe as they try and replace coal with wood pellets. It's gotten a lot of press recently with significant production ramping up, particularly in the southeast. And I think there is legitimate concern there about the scale of that demand and the carrying capacity of forests, and yes, the market drivers that could push us towards more plantation forestry. Here in the Northeast, in the Northern Forest, we don't yet have the export pressure. We don't have good rail transport across this region. We don't have many deep water ports, and there are still pretty good markets for low-grade wood. So there isn't, there's not, pellets and wood energy are part of the mix, but there is still pulp and paper production. So that helps to put a little bit of the pressure off of bioenergy. At this point, we also biomass electric generation in this region. we have, in terms of the center's approach, we have put a real explicit focus on thermal applications of biomass energy. So using it for heat. For a couple of reasons. It's the most efficient use of the wood. 85% of the energy in the wood is used, whereas with electric generation, it's more like 25%. And then there's also the community benefit angle that, again, I would say that there's a biomass electric plant that's going to go online this month in Berlin, New Hampshire, which is converting an old pulp mill. It's a significant local economic project. It's employed hundreds of people in its construction. It's going to pull 750,000 tons of wood a year, which equates to a lot of jobs in logging and trucking. But it's going to employ directly less than 40 people, and that electricity is put onto to wires and sent out of the region. If we compare that to our wood heating project, where we are keeping the benefit and the wealth really 100% locally, I think we see, and many communities in this region see, the community benefits there. So at least in the Northeast so far, thermal energy is really gaining a lot of the focus. There's a community appreciation for it, and it's not at a scale yet where we're concerned about it stressing the forest resource. But that is certainly something that we and many others have our eyes on, that, the danger of success, essentially.
Mm-hmm. Well, it seems like keeping the loop local makes a big difference. So that's good to hear. What are some of the technical barriers to converting from oil to pellet heating systems, and what education efforts are in place to increase capacity for conversion?
If you have a hot water heating system, the technical barriers are very few. This is really a plug and play type system. The footprint of a wood pellet boiler itself is very directly comparable to the footprint of an oil boiler. You do have to think about your pellet storage. What we use is, in most of our installations, is a 3-ton bag that sits suspended in a frame in your basement. But again, you have a footprint for your oil tank already, and the pellets can also be outdoors in a silo if that's what the homeowner really wants to do. So the technical barriers are few. It's trickier. I don't want to get too into the weeds on this, but it's trickier if you have hot air or steam heat to make the conversion. But the real barriers, again, are the perception ones. Again, this is viewed as an unfamiliar technology. There's concern about is it safe? Does it work? So that's really what our demonstration projects are focused on. Are demonstrating in real-world settings that these systems work just as well. Really, the only interaction you need to have with it, if you want, is to tweak your thermostat and carry out a little bucket of ash maybe once a month. So that perception barrier is really the big one, and then also the financing barrier that I mentioned. It's not that easy yet to get a loan for one of these systems, but that's in many ways the goal, is that you would be able to finance your boiler perhaps the way you finance your car. You take out a small loan up front to cover the capital costs. The difference with a car, though, is with one of these boilers, you're saving money over time, and you can use that to pay back the loan.
Great. Thank you for that explanation. Our next question from the audience is related to the carbon market. So there are rumors of saturation in the domestic forest carbon project market and a backlog of projects in the California sphere. Is the Northern Forest Center incorporating carbon markets into its long-term vision for community growth, or simply as an opportunistic value add? And a follow-up to that is what makes a carbon project viable, in your opinion?
Good questions. I would say the jury is out at this point on whether this is going to be a long-term community development tool. I have not, and I'm sure there's folks on this call who are much more into this than I am. I have not heard too much concern about the saturation issue yet with regards to the California market, but there's definitely a sense that now is the time to get into it. That that saturation point may be reached somewhat soon, and then also, of course, if the market is working, the demand will start to go down over time. I think we've seen, the Farm Cove Community Forest example that I shared. Again, that's the first carbon sale that I'm aware of from the Northern Forest region into the California market. It's a great example. It hit a lot of those nice bells and whistles in terms of community development objectives. I think it's less clear how many, is that going to be the exception or more of the rule in terms of the types of projects that are possible. I think another reason the jury's out is that a lot of right now the California market really works for larger landowners, for well-stocked properties. Those are the ones that are going to attract the interest of the carbon project development firms who cover the very significant upfront costs to get a forest carbon project developed. The opportunities are not quite as obvious for smaller landowners, which dominate a lot of this landscape. So if you just have a couple hundred acres, or even if you have a larger acreage, but it's really been cut hard over time and is not well stocked, there are fewer opportunities there. So that's a space that we're active in trying to understand. Are there, for example, aggregation possibilities or other ways that some of those smaller landowners could benefit from the California market? But I think it's a great question. It's something we certainly don't have an answer to, is how big an opportunity is this going to be, and how long will it be with us?
That makes a lot of sense. So speaking of smaller landowners and the different stakeholders in the Northern Forest region, what is your organization's relationship with tribal communities?
Another good question. Not a deep one. I think there's been some tribal engagement in our community forest programming currently in Maine, but that's the most substantive engagement that we've had to date.
And how about your connections and interaction with the Forest Service?
Most of our interaction with the Forest Service has been in the public policy sphere. I think again our focus is much more in the private lands context. We have, of course, the White Mountain National Forest and the Green Mountain National Forest. So in New Hampshire, and to a lesser degree where we have projects close to the National Forest, there's some interaction with the Forest Service around those specific projects. But most of our work with the Forest Service has been helping to shape and advocate for their programs, things like the Forest Legacy Program, a relatively new one called the Community Forest Program, which provides funding, both technical assistance as well as acquisition funding for community forest projects. There's a program that was created in the last Farm Bill but never funded called the Community Wood Energy Program that would be really a great program to help accelerate the conversions from fuel oil to wood heat by community facilities. So that's the extent. Most of our interaction with the Forest Service is in really looking at their funding streams and their programs, how they touch down in this region, and how we can help grow them.
Great. Thank you, Joe. So another question from our audience is related to measuring impacts in community development. This is a term that's often difficult to succinctly define, let alone quantify. How do you guys conceptualize growth at the Northern Forest Center in this particular area?
I think there may have been two questions in that one, or at least two that I heard. In terms of the quantifying benefit, I'm just going to go back to the one slide that I had here. I think this is a really key aspect, is how do we, community development is traditionally, and economic development is, jobs are the metric that so many people are focused on. And that includes a lot of our federal funding partners, USDA Rural Development, for example. A lot of their metrics for success revolve around job creation. We think it's really key to think about economic development more broadly, and I think, again, the Model Neighborhood Project is an example of that. There are jobs created, will be jobs created as the wood pellet industry expands. Again, the harvesting, processing, delivery, servicing, and installing. But again, they're sort of the multiplier effects and that local economic impact. This is probably the best example we have of how we try and quantify those outcomes, but I think it's something that we're increasingly doing for all of our programs. How do we count not just the widgets, the number of community forests created, the number of boilers installed, the number of businesses assisted, but how do we go a bit further down the chain to understand what's different in the world as a result of that? That may sound obvious. It's not something that I think the nonprofit community in particular has been very good at historically. So I think that's a key piece of it. I'm less sure I understand the second part of the question about how do we define growth, but I think that's maybe this gets at it a little bit. How do we define success? So for here, we'd want to see that that total economic value to the local economy. We'd like to see that number increase exponentially over the next decade as we see broader adoption of these systems. You could apply a similar metric to our work with secondary wood products manufacturers, where we want to see not just job growth, but we want to see increased market share for those companies, increasing sales, as well as innovation and new types of products emerging from that sector.
Thank you for sort of helping us navigate through that question. And Joe, have you incorporated public health considerations at all into the community development metrics?
Not explicitly. I think we, very early on in our existence as an organization, we did a publication called the Northern Forest Wealth Index, which you can find on our website. And its subtitle is Exploring a Deeper Meaning of Wealth. And part of that assessment and analysis did get at sort of individual well-being, which I think is a part of public health. When I hear public health, my mind goes immediately again to biomass energy, where that is definitely a topic of discussion and some debate, and it's an important one. We have to be sure in pursuing all of these value streams that we're not damaging public health. And I think, again, wood energy, because of the potential for particulate emissions, is where that tends to focus. But again, in this particular, specific to wood energy, this technology, because it is highly efficient, and also because of the pollution control mechanisms that can be put in place, is not one we're concerned about in terms of public health.
Great, thank you very much. And Joe, you mentioned a couple times about how conservation easements are a foundation to your work in the Northern Forest region. Can you please elaborate on how ecosystem services are incorporated into easements? For instance, does the grantee need to retain rights to ecosystem services, and how is this typically framed and worded in your experience?
That's a good question, and I'm not the best person to answer it, since I'm not into the weeds of the particular easements. But I think the idea of explicitly calling out things like carbon rights is fairly new. And I know what I'm sure a lot of you know as well, that specific to California, if an easement was put in place less than 7 years ago, there may be an opportunity for that piece of land to participate. But if the easement is older than 7 years, it can't participate in California because of the additionality issue. I think landowners, and again, this is where there are folks who are far more sophisticated than me on this, landowners and some of the TMOs, I think are thinking about, as they develop easements, where they can reserve those rights. Specific to again, to come back to the Grand Lake Stream example, the progression of that. So there are two properties there. There's the Farm Cove property that just sold the carbon into California. The community forest that they're going to create adjacent to that, 22,000 acres. Its progression is from private, land management. I forget specifically who owned it, but it was a landowner who was going to sell it potentially for development. TMO, in that case, Lime Timber came in. They bought the land with support from a new markets tax credit that we helped facilitate. They're going to own it for a period of 7 years, and in that period of 7 years, I think they're looking at the values they can derive from the land, including carbon sales. And then the end game, or at least the idea, is that at the end, that ownership translates into the community. So I think there's an example of, I think the basic example is that it really has to be thought through in advance. And yes, in certain instances, there's some ways to reserve rights. In others, I think it becomes more complicated. But it's absolutely something that needs to be thought about as easements are developed going forward.
Great, thank you, Joe. And it's clear that the Northern Forest Center has multiple programs and initiatives to connect ecosystem services and community development. And are these consistent and integrated throughout each state and locality in the region, or are these mostly discrete projects and interventions tied to specific locations?
Good question. I think currently they are more on the discrete projects end of the spectrum, but the idea, and this really gets to our theory of change as an organization, is that so things like the Model Neighborhood Project, we develop in specific, for specific communities across the region, one in each state is our goal. But this project and all of the others that we undertake are really designed, they're test projects, but they're designed to be replicated. So for example, we're already seeing other communities in our region and beyond. We just got an inquiry last week from Massachusetts who are interested in the whole model neighborhood concept and how do they transition clustered homes or community facilities towards wood heating. So the idea is that these discrete projects over time are scaled up. And I think that's one reason we work as a regional organization, which is challenging at times. I mean, it's 700 miles to get across the whole northern forest and hundreds of distinct communities within it. But I think that regional perspective helps accelerate the adoption of good ideas. On the first slide where I went through basically what we do as an organization, there was that 30,000 foot level, and that really is about we are telling communities and partners, for example, in upstate New York about what's happening in the Berlin Model Neighborhood Project, and they're getting excited about that. Wood products companies that we've worked with in Maine are sharing their stories and what they've achieved with companies in other states. So that's how we hope to move from that, those discrete projects, those dots on the map, to change that is really scaled across the region.
Great, thank you so much, Joe. And I think with that, looking at the time, we'll have to go ahead and wrap up. So, Joe, this was so interesting, and we really look forward to following your work. Thank you to the audience for joining Seabay and Island Press for this edition of Nature's Returns, Investing in Ecosystem Services. Please join us next Thursday, December 12th, for a presentation from Brad Hunter with Craft 3 in Portland, Oregon. That'll be the last in our mini-series focusing on ecosystem services and community development. Thank you so much, Joe, and we look forward to keeping in touch.
Thanks, everybody.